Now, I first met Kate 3 or 4 weeks ago at the Bondi Pavilion. She was speaking at the launch of a new political party, the Together Party, which is hoping to capture a Senate spot at the next federal election. Kate was one of a team of talented speakers who put forward their vision for a better Australia. Now, she spoke of the perils of life as an independent artist, and I'm sure she'll tell you a bit about that tonight. For instance, Kate lives at home with her partner in her parents' house in Lismore. That's what you do when your annual income is around $30,000 a year. She's a writer and a performer trained in dance, puppetry and performance, and she's an associate artist at Northern Rivers Performing Arts and wrote and performed the recent show Wonder Babes. She's also the associate director of the dance company Sprung, and she's won and been shortlisted for a raft of awards, including from the Ian Potter Cultural Trust. She's performed around the country and last year in Germany. Kate has very strong views about the proportion of the National Arts budget that goes straight into the hands each year at the 28 major performing arts companies. As most people know, those 28 companies get 2/3 of the National Arts budget. The other third is shared by Kate and the estimated 499 other independent companies who struggle to stay afloat in this country. Kate is in the perfect position to explore tonight how artists such as her can get their message heard amidst the noise of a federal election campaign. Also with us tonight is Kerry Glasscock, a woman who, when you mention her name, people tend to say, "My God, how does she do it?" Indeed, the Sydney Morning Herald named her one of our 100 most influential and inspiring people. Kate's director and CEO of the Sydney Fringe. She founded the underground live music club venue 505 in Surrey Hills and the award-winning 505 Theatre in Newtown. It's entirely artist-run and self-funded, and these venues present more than 350 shows a year. In her spare time, when that's not keeping her busy enough, Kerry's an advisor to the City of Sydney on how to keep our nighttime economy afloat, which is something of a challenge these days. And finally with us tonight is someone who barely needs an introduction, Tony Burke, MP, the Shadow Minister for the Arts and the leader of opposition business. Now, for those of you who don't follow these things closely, no one gets the gig of leader of opposition business unless you're an absolutely first-class technician and, dare I say it, raw political animal. With the arts forever struggling for a place on the national agenda, I can't think of anyone better to hang on to the arts should Labor win in May. He's also brilliantly placed to talk to us tonight about how the arts can lobby better on behalf of itself. Clearly, we haven't done too well with the current government. As host tonight, Kate will speak first. We'll then hear from Kerry Glasscock and then Tony Burke before Kate throws some tough questions their way. It will then be your turn. Please remember that a question is a question. It's not a statement, it's not a manifesto, and it's certainly not a diatribe. So keep your questions really clear and brief. Mr. Burke has to be out of here by 7, so we don't have much time. Over to you, Kate, if I can swing this around your way.
Great, thanks. And wow. And thanks to SAMAG for having us all tonight. I just am going to start by giving a bit of a brief of sort of my feelings about the independent arts sector and its funding. So, in the 90s, 23 performing arts companies were shored up and protected. They were protected so that they wouldn't collapse from the incoming tide of overseas work. These are the AMPAG companies, and there are now 28. They're the Belvoir Theatres, the Australian Ballets, the Opera Australias. They're also Bangarra, but they are predominantly state majors. For our industry, this was a good thing, and it shored up the Australian performing arts companies so they could survive, continue to take risks, and carve out a national voice. Ironically, those companies are now known for being risk-averse. These 28 companies do continue to get 2/3 of Australia Council funding. Meanwhile, the other third is shared amongst the 500 independent companies, cut up into bite-sized chunks, which are too small to do anything much with. To reinforce what this means, regional performing arts companies are not funded to exist. The way we fund the performing arts hasn't changed since the 90s, but the Australian cultural landscape has changed dramatically. AMPAG is a quarantined, privileged group defining performing arts making in Australia. To give perspective, one Melbourne-based AMPAG company gets $6 million from the feds and $6 million from the states every year. That's the deal, because they're AMPAG. I'm talking federal level funding, and if you're wondering if the states pick up the slack, in a Create New South Wales grant round for new projects last year, 3% of applicants were funded. 3% definitely makes it not worth the effort to apply. As an independent artist or arts company, you have to question your culture continuously. You have to dig deep every day and question if what you are making is worthy to you, to your community, to politics, to diversity, to accessibility. And this is a good thing. The arts should be radical. This accountability is why independent performing artists are making the most dangerous and thrilling, progressive and beneficial art for audiences to experience. The independent work is the frontier. We as a country should be accountable on all these fronts for all of the work that we do, and to everything we do in business and other industries too. We should aspire to this. The independent arts shows us how, and that is why they are so vital. And audiences agree. 1/3 of audience attendance in Australia is at AMPAG companies, and 2/3 is at the rest of the 500 companies. Yet independent companies and artists apply for funding at every stage of every project, justifying repeatedly why their project is worthy to continue, committing artists and their collaborators to the trap of spending endless hours in the grant writing vortex, proving they are worthy of the scraps, which drastically limits the time they spend actually making art. Or projects are self-funded by supplementary careers, partners, income, or family support. Limiting the breadth of representation in our performing arts to those who are privileged to be able to make these sacrifices, or privileged like myself to be able to live with my parents. When you have to beg for money, it makes you feel worthless, and it makes you feel like your art is worthless. 2 years ago, I received $5,000 to enable me to begin my first major project. And I cried when they called me on the phone. Tears of gratitude. This is the way that the funding model reduces us to beggars. $5,000 is giving rations to the poor, just enough to keep them alive and keep them begging, but not enough to do anything meaningful with, not enough to help you get above your station. And this is how the majority of Australia's performing arts is being actualised. To make performing arts productions commercially viable and internationally sellable, we need to pay designers, composers, directors, performers to bring their unique skills together to alchemically build a coherent, visually resolved, thrilling whole for the stage. We need to pay an army. All the independents do, just like the majors. And that is the army that Australia should be investing in. The main thing independent performing artists need to make this happen is to have a living wage so collaboration can take place between artists from any sector or discipline and around the country without pushing each other into poverty. With a living wage for artists, so many more ensemble-style companies would emerge, where artists who have a shared vision can work together over months, years, decades, to deliver world-class bodies of work that are responsive, deeply connected to who we are, and born from a collective passion. The companies in Australia that achieve this despite the odds are our most loved and programmed companies nationally and internationally. When I speak of this model as a way to make, inspired by like companies abroad, weary mentors tell me we don't have a funding model to make that kind of work in Australia. I want a conversation in the public arena, on our televisions, about the value of innovative and independent art making for the Australian economy. I want the Australian people to be given the chance to understand what creative lives contribute to a sense of compassion for one another, to forward thinking, and to an alternative to complacency and individualist politics that ask Australians to look inward to their perception of immediate and personal gain. We need independent arts to understand ourselves as a nation, a diverse community full of ideas and able to connect across class and culture divides. While the government believes that the performing arts is a live history museum where the privileged can nod knowingly from their seats, we are, for me, completely stunted as a creative nation. And I'm looking forward to discussing some of these ideas with the two of you this evening. Did you want to introduce the other two now, or? Yep, okay. No problem. So I'm passing over to Kerry to have a chat.
Sure, thank you. Most people who know me know I'm pro-indie. That is in every area where I work, always. I think that for me, I want to always frame this conversation around one important point, first of all, which is we need more money for arts funding in general. I'm always reluctant to enter into the conversation of a divide between us and them, of the majors and the indie world, because I think when that divide was created in, the 90s, we lived in a completely different landscape. When I think about the early 90s, it was a time when we didn't really have an independent theatre scene. It was when it was starting in places like Sydney. We had we had the majors, and we had amateur theatre, and we had some theatre restaurants and places like that. But what we know of now as the indie world was just starting. And so the landscape has changed so rapidly over the last kind of 20 years to what the lay of the land is now, compared to having each city one university that used to put out one class of graduates every year who used to walk into fairly permanent employment on television stations or radio stations. It's a different world. And the bulk of the artists now that graduate from universities or are self-educated will work in the independent sector, full stop. They will never work in the major companies. They will never work in the large-scale venues or festivals that we have, or they will work in them once a year. And most artists will earn their living, although it might not be a living wage, they will earn their living in the tiny rooms like this one, and like my 150-seat music venue, and those spaces that haven't traditionally been considered as high art or performance spaces. But these are the nuts and bolts of what we as a sector earn our living in, be it a living wage or not. And I think it's often very easy when you sit in rooms with representatives from the major performing arts companies, as I do often, and straight away the argument comes to, but we employ people. You know, you can't take away our funding because we employ people. And I say, well, so do I. They just don't get paid. Yeah? Because at the moment we're set up in a system that means there is just no money for anybody. And that can't just be the responsibility of the government. It has to also be the responsibility of venues and artists and producers. And most importantly, for me, the thing that is often left out of the conversation is audiences. We have to invest in the development of new audiences, because I certainly know that my venues aren't full every night, and I know that this venue is not full every night, and I know that lots of people are sitting on their couch watching Netflix. So really, it really has to be about funding to invest in the development of audiences, of the next generation of audiences. And I'd love to see a conversation where we start to shake up the funding model that matches the way our world is now. What about seed funding, investment funding? What about interest-free loans? Why does it have to be a funding system that relies on a handout? Sydney Fringe is a great example, and a lot of organisations our size and our age encounter this. We're just turning 10 this year. Now, if you're one of the lucky independent arts organisations that has made it past year 6 and you've survived, you've done so on sweat equity as well as an organisation. It's not sustainable on under-resourced teams, and you just need an injection of cash. Really, that's what you need. You need someone to just give you a few years of seed funding so that you can leverage all the other opportunities you have created around you. So let's look at other opportunities. I'd love to look at a whole framework where it's about saying, you know, let's look at companies who have made it and who have a track record of excellence. Can we invest in them as we would in another industry? Consider them as businesses and as entrepreneurs, and we invest in them. We don't just hand out. And I'm very keen on that. Tony.
Thanks, Kerry.
Okay, Thanks. I was our Labor's last Arts Minister, and I hope in a few weeks' time to be our next Arts Minister.
Yeah.
I'm going through a relatively large interview process at the moment. A very big panel. I've got so much I'd like to say, but I want to save as much as I can for questions. So if I can start with what rarely comes up and what I think is one of the biggest missing pieces of the puzzle. For those of you who haven't met me before, this policy area is one of my reasons for being in politics in the first place. I joined the Labor Party passionate about the arts, passionate about the environment, arrived in Parliament the same election as Peter Garrett and thought, well, there you go, that's never going to happen. And then ended up with both portfolios and hold them again now. And Bill has assured me that if we win, I will have the arts portfolio. He said it is too much trouble to give it to anyone else. The big thing that I think changed, even bigger than the Brandis cuts when the change of government happened in 2013, was the instant evaporation, disappearance of cultural policy. And both Paul Keating and Julia Gillard, what they brought forth, we didn't call it an arts policy, we called it a cultural policy. And that is because of the particular role that the arts plays in defining how we feel our place in Australia, how we see each other, and how the world sees us. The cultural policy that we had under Julia, which was announced by Simon Crean, and 3 days later I was Arts Minister, and so then implemented by me, was founded on 5 pillars: First Nations, diversity, the centrality of the artist, the importance of institutions, and the way we then communicate the message, including new media of communication. Across those 5 pillars, I think there is a framework that we need to bring back. And beyond everything that I'm now trying to push through my party for an arts announcement only a few weeks hence, what I think is the most important part of it is that we bring back and update Creative Australia so that we have a cultural policy for the nation again. The second thing that I think changed, which if I give you a very quick moment in Melbourne, when I was putting together a contemporary music policy which led to the formation of the Office of Live Music. And around the table, one person had a go at how much money goes to Opera Australia. Everybody else in the room instantly turned on that person and said, no, we don't do that. We're about growing the pie. We're not going to go after other sectors. 6 years later, because of the Brandis cuts, that conversation has changed. Has changed fundamentally, and I respect and understand. I respect and understand why it has changed, because those cuts were leveraged pretty much exclusively on the small to medium and independent sector. That's where it hit. So I understand why the conversation has changed, but my preference, and we're not at the point of announcement yet, but my preference is to have a situation where the cuts are returned rather than to accept that it's one part of the arts sector against another. The real shift as I look at it is there are 2 different ways of funding, and both are legitimate ways of funding. For some organisations to be funded based on their record, and for other organisations to be funded on project funding. What I don't believe, though, is that those funded on their record should be a club that you can never join, and once you're in it, you seemingly can never leave. And that's my criticism of the major performing arts system. I would prefer it to exist with a much longer tail, with very clear KPIs measured largely against the national cultural policy, where on each review period, new companies could come onto that form of funding, and companies that are performing against national cultural policy move up higher, and companies that are not performing move down lower, so that people could see a transparency rather than a club. I think as a process, I certainly prefer that, but I do think the whole sense of the ecology of the arts sector in Australia has changed fundamentally purely because of those cuts from Brandis. And even though the government will claim they have returned the cuts, they committed all that money to specific projects before they returned the cuts. So the Australia Council has effectively been the contract manager for them, rather than the Australia Council having any discretion over what happens to that money once it was returned. I might stop there, only because there will be no end to these remarks, other than to simply say to all of you, thank you for what you do. The reason, and thank you in particular at this moment in history for what you do. It has never been more important for people to feel secure in their place within Australia, and for people to understand the diversity of each other than it is right now. And without a really thriving arts sector, I don't know how we do it.
Thanks, Tony. Thank you, both of you. I think one thing that came up a couple of times just now was about the difference between pitting the sort of AMPAG companies against the independent companies, and what value that has. I guess I would bring up around that question how we can begin to communicate to the Australian population about how that is actually existing in our community, and at what point we can see politicians actually begin to start speaking about the arts publicly, so that there is a sense of understanding that this is going on. Because while I completely agree that there is no good in arguing to transfer money around, we just need more money. And the AMPAG companies need the money that they need to do what they do. Absolutely. But the independent sector is, as Kerry said, just continuing despite being completely in a state of poverty. So I guess I would just be throwing back to you, Tony, and Kerry, if you want to speak to this as well, about despite the fact that we can sit here and talk about this in this room, when this is going to become part of the public agenda, and when this is going to be discussed as part of the campaign leading up to the election.
Last election, during the campaign, we had an arts launch, and I suspect we'll do a formal arts launch again. We did a contemporary music launch separately last year, and I did that quite deliberately, so that, because a whole lot of people argue, oh, the art's not really relevant to me. And contemporary music, I just thought, was the perfect gateway where everybody in some way is touched by it and knows it and has aspects of it that they love, and it's become part of how they see the country. If I can just touch, Kate, on one thing that you said about the majors, because it is a criticism that I have of the majors, and they've been driven there by government. But they have constantly had impressed on them, one of the key measures is how much can they leverage philanthropically, rather than how much can they leverage culturally. And in terms of the KPIs that would be put against them on review, if we had the sort of sliding scale that I described, I am deeply concerned when additional money goes to the majors and they provide it for more fundraisers to maximise their philanthropic effort. Not because the philanthropic effort isn't important, but it's hardly the aim and objective of Commonwealth taxpayers' money. And so if we had principles like co-productions, if we had principles like original Australian work, if you had those sorts of principles and the pillars that I went through, particularly First Nations and diversity, as measures against which their work will be tested for future funding, I do think you'll get a behavioural change. I do think you'll get more... Oh, sorry.
No, so you agree that you feel like there should be a shift in the way that AMPAG companies are able to access their secured funding?
Oh, that's what I was saying. Yeah. No, I think the system of some companies being paid based on their record rather than having to apply for project funding each time, I do believe that makes sense. There are some smaller companies where it would absolutely make sense for them as well. But you then have to work out what are you measuring it against. And I don't necessarily want to... I don't think there's massive cultural... If, for example, a major, and no majors do this, which makes it a perfect example, if their entire year's season was performances of classic Oscar Wilde plays, I would question the cultural value to Australia of that program. Now, I accept that the playwright is not the only artist, and other people's works of art as directors, as performers, as technicians, all of that needs to be factored in. But how would that compare to a company that's producing entirely new Australian work? Well, in terms of cultural leverage, the one doing the entirely new Australian work is leveraging more culturally. And I think that needs to be weighed up. And if companies are given clear KPIs on what's expected for Commonwealth money, some companies may decide they'd rather go after the audience and philanthropic dollars than go after the Commonwealth dollars. They can make that decision with their eyes wide open. Without a cultural policy in place, they are given no guidance other than do as much as you can to get as many people through the door, which is a legitimate thing for any business to do. But it's not necessarily the prime reason that a Commonwealth government funds the Australia Council.
Yes, and I've heard a number of people say to me that they feel that if there are these companies that are existing based off the subscriber audience that they are playing to, that perhaps the subscriber philanthropists can fund that work. I want to see, Kerry, if you would like to ask a question to Tony.
Sure, okay. I am a big fan of the establishment of the Live Music Office, and Sydney Fringe has worked for many, many years, and I think it was one of the great achievements when you were Arts Minister. Has there been consideration for a similar office for performing arts, particularly independent small to mediums? Because I think one of the things we do lack is a consolidated voice that has access to government, and also an office that can really investigate. You know, I found it interesting when we were saying there's 400 odd indie companies. Are there? I reckon there's at least 400 just in Sydney. Like, where are they recorded? Are they mapped? And do we know really what the whole shape of our sector is?
Well, the answer is there a plan for that? No. Is there an argument for it? There's a compelling one that you just made. I should add, because not everyone will be aware, just with the live music example, each of the, well, certainly for my side of politics, each of our governments have come to office now at a state level. Obviously not here, but you all know that. Too soon. But each of those state Labor governments that we had came to office with a live music policy through consultation with the Live Music Office. The fingerprints of that office, and there's a whole lot of local councils that have been doing the same. So in terms of what that sort of body can provide, it's really significant. The question, I guess, which I don't know the answer to, would be where would you house it? Because one of the things that was great about the Live Music Office, because we didn't put it within there was an argument as to whether we'd put it in the department or whether we'd put it in APRA. We put it in APRA. Because it was in APRA, Brandis couldn't cut it. And so it survived the whole way through. If there's not a change of government in 6 weeks' time, it will probably die because its funding's now hit the limit. But by you having it housed outside of government, I think has really worked in terms of having a better sense of commercial issues, but it also has insulated it against a government that would be otherwise hostile.
Thanks. And Tony, do you have any questions that you would like to throw to us?
Has anything been getting easier?
No. No, that's not true. Look, I think, you know, we're all a little shaken up over the results of the weekend, as you know. However, let's look at what some of the main election issues were in our state for the first time ever: nighttime economy, live music, it is on the agenda when it hasn't been before, and that only bodes well for us. I'm always the one in the room at these round tables saying live music and performance. Let's look at us all together. So, in the sense of access to government and being able to have conversations, it absolutely has gotten better over the last few years. It's not. There has been no progress, however, unfortunately, in New South Wales, in my experience, for the small to mediums under the current government, and with the ability to put your hand up and try and get some funding and get some movement on that station. We're still seeing the majority of those decisions going to big capital works projects at the main stage companies, and not much happening on the front for the small to mediums. And as one of the people in the city who own their own performance spaces that are completely commercially run, it has gotten only harder over the last few years under the current regulatory conditions of this state, and also cost of living in Sydney is making it very difficult to do business if you're running a performance-focused space.
Yeah, I would just like to point out that I've been at a few different events in Sydney, Melbourne and in the Northern Rivers in the last few weeks, and I've had quite astounding interactions with other independent artists that I assumed were doing really well. Like, I'd see their Facebook posts about all of their grand successes, and then I would see them and they would be haggard and exhausted and burnt out and stressed and just kind of a mess, and like, oh, I'm so sorry, and they would be describing how they just absolutely can't find money to develop their own works, and constantly trying to put a front on of being successful in order to be the one to get the money next, but really struggling and saying things like, I just had to go overseas for a year just to clear my head because it's so dire here. And when I look at companies like Norpa, where I work up in the Northern Rivers, and seeing the fact that their capacity to make new work is totally limited. So in the past, where they were able to make the works that they imagined, they are now kind of getting more and more knockbacks and struggling even harder to make new work. But the one thing that I would say that does seem to be improving is the representation of different voices on our stages. And that seems to have made a positive impact on people recognising that they do have a place and they do have a voice. And then I think when we recognise at the same time how much of our community aren't aware of the importance of that diversity of voices, which we've seen through recent events such as the Christchurch situation, where the response that the Australian government had to that and the response that the Australian people have had to that in comparison to how New Zealand responded shows us that we have such a long way to go to understand ourselves as a diverse nation. And I really feel like even though there's been small wins for the kind of voices that are on our stages, we just have so much further to go. And to me, honestly, as an artist, it makes me feel like I want to go and live in another country where there is respect for different cultures. So that's how I feel about how it's getting easier and also not at the same time. Did you want to respond at all to that? Or I might throw it out to the audience for questions now. Yes, wow, hands shoot up, yes.
My question is Tony, and your statement that you would want to update Creative Australia. Are you able to commit to doing that fairly early in Labor's first term, if it gets elected? Because with both Creative Nation and Creative Australia, they went to the fag end of the last two Labor governments, too late to have any serious impact. And secondly, as part of that update, would you look at seriously valuing the extent of, very new term, sweat equity, the extent to which independent artists invest so much of their own personal and financial capital in making art, and that investment is not always understood, valued or recognised, along with the extent to which independent artists take risks to make their art, and the level of that risk, which they often the least equipped to actually bear, is not often recognised.
Yeah, I don't know your name, sorry. Larry. Thanks, Larry. First of all, I'm not in a position to be able to make commitments because that's for when we get to the point of the launch. The reason that my disposition is to do an update of Creative Australia rather than to say we would develop a new cultural policy is for the exact reason that you raised. I'd say with both Julia Gillard and with Paul Keating, neither of them were planning that it was the end of their government. But you're right, in both instances, development of a cultural policy takes a long time. That's why I'd rather be in a space of update. Should we win, it will only be just over 6 years since it was first announced. So I think there will be things that need to be updated. You've raised one of them that's completely legitimate. By doing an update instead of a multi-year process, it should be a process I imagine that would take in the order of 6 months.
Another question. Oh, and just to let everyone know that Tony has to leave right on 7, so we're going to just go right to the time. So, sorry. Yes.
Empty commercial spaces are just crippling to villages, livability, and filling them with artist rehearsal spaces, entrepreneurs, startups would be not only create jobs and opportunity, but make places more vibrant, dare I say, increase real estate values, which everyone in Sydney is obsessed with. So I know Create New South Wales has always been looking at this and pushing, and City of Sydney is starting to, and often leads a lot of the other councils. What can the federal government do to make empty commercial spaces available?
There is an organisation I've met on this, Chrissy. My recollection is they were in Newcastle.
Renew.
That...
Not...
I beg your pardon?
It's ended.
Oh, it's ended.
It doesn't work for performing arts either, but I know exactly what Tony can do. We need a state variation in the National Construction Code for a small arts variation to enable any type of performance or cultural activity to just go into any type of class building without it being deemed high risk and needing to upgrade to a 9B, place of public assembly. And maybe some tax reform would be amazing that doesn't reward landowners for having vacant commercial space, but rather perhaps makes it worse.
Because it's exactly the same, isn't it? Whether it's empty, it's a tax deduction if it's empty.
It's a tax deduction for a commercial landowner to have a commercial tenancy empty. So there is really no incentive unless they completely get it as to why they would put something in there temporarily or at a reduced rent or for a creative purpose, and then add on the layer of extra regulation that adds for anything to do with creative and performing arts, and you've got a terrible situation.
The answer is I've taken notes on what Kerry just said.
Good job, Tony. Who else had a question? Sorry, you went ahead.
My name's Antonia. I just wanted to explore a little bit this idea of increasing the pie for everyone. And if you could talk a little bit about what is it that we need to do to persuade all of the politicians in Parliament that the arts really significantly add value to our communities.
Thanks, Antoinetta. I wouldn't underestimate the amount of goodwill that's already there around the cabinet table. And often from really surprising quarters. I won't now name people because then it gives away that I was surprised when they were pro the arts. But there is more goodwill than you might otherwise think. In terms of what can be done, what was done at the last election, where arts organisations were involved in postcard campaigns, where performing arts, people were standing up at the end, putting their hand up, cast members during curtain call, as to who had started an independent theatre or where independent theatre had been critical to work, and they did that at the majors as well. And effectively spoke directly to audiences of what these cuts are doing to us. The power of that was incredible because There are three issues. One is the straight budget decisions that happen. The second is how much goodwill is genuinely felt around the cabinet table. The third issue, which always plays in because people are trying to win an election, is politically how will it play. And there is an acceptance that I have, and I'm probably more understanding of than some of my colleagues, that part of funding the arts is that you'll fund some people who then use the platform and stand up and have a go at you, and that's life, and that's fine, and you get on with it. Not everybody's as good with that as I am. And what happened at the last campaign, where the arts sector said really clearly, we're standing up because you're backing us, made a lot of difference. I don't know, even though the cuts have caused just as much problem now, I certainly haven't seen that same energy from within the arts sector at this election. I don't know if it's because people, to some extent, have already banked what they think the outcome will be, or what it is, I don't know, or...
Exhaustion.
Yes, that it's exhaustion, yeah. Because it takes a lot of work. That whole situation with branders, there were companies all over the place who stopped doing their art making work because they were campaigning about returning the cuts to the Australian Council. And it's really problematic when you have someone who's in a position of power who will turn around and make a subjective choice about not trusting the Australian Council to disseminate that money, but instead going, they're not doing a good job, it needs to come over here because there are people that I think are worth getting funded who are not getting funded. And so my question is more around, how do we influence politicians who are not really understanding, don't see the arts as a priority, don't value the contribution that the arts makes to cohesive communities, people's health and well-being, children learning with creativity, evolving people ready for jobs in the future. I mean, there are politicians who are not really in that mindset.
Yeah, okay, if I can answer more precisely then. And the contemporary music policy, I know I keep going back to it, but it's one we have announced, so I can give you some certainty as to the framework. When I was minister, I used to be shocked at the notes I would get from the department, because I'd be opening an exhibition and they would be how many tourists were going to come, the value of it for the economy, the negotiation, the insurance bill, all this sort of stuff. And I remember looking at them and saying, but aren't I Minister for the Arts? Am I going to say something about the art? And so I basically never used the notes, because I figured if I can't stand up for the intrinsic value of the art, why on earth am I in the portfolio? But that said, your point is right, that we shouldn't be shy of acknowledging this is the one portfolio that touches every portfolio. If you go through the contemporary music policy, I did something that's normally not considered politically smart. Normally, smart politics is people walk away with one big idea. What I did quite deliberately was spread the policy and the available money that we had over as many different portfolios as possible. So why did we fund Sounds Australia? It made clear the role of music in export with foreign affairs and trade. Why did we fund Support Act? Because it showed industrial relations issues for people in the sector as workers is something that matters. Why did we talk about the Australian Investment Guarantee? Because people who are putting up money to make this work need to have a taxation system where they can, as quickly as possible, be able to start claiming deductions on it. Why did we talk about the different programs of education in schools and establishing the music hubs? Because arts education makes kids smarter. Why did we go through and have money, and it wasn't massive amounts, but significant donations to Nordhoff Robbins every year? Because the role of music in helping sick people become healthy again is intrinsically important and powerful. So I do think there is a way into every portfolio and around the cabinet table for the people who don't immediately go to the intrinsic value. The power of the arts in each of those areas is something that is always a way in.
So Chris, and all critical stages touring. Question for Kerry and Tony, picking up on Antonio's point. My question is more about how we lobby for effectively for the Australian population as broadly to understand the effectiveness and the importance and integrity of a vibrant arts culture and of funding that arts culture. Because interestingly, as you no doubt both seen there, it's probably maybe late, but sometime last year, Australia Council released data saying sort of 98-99% of us engaged with the arts, and that number has been increasing the last few years, but consequently the number of people who support government funding for the arts has actually been decreasing at about the same rate. And so how do you, I mean, I was involved in the I Stand With the Arts campaign a few years back, and obviously that made an impact in that moment, but it was a lot of time and investment. What do you think is the effective way that we can all be doing to kind of effectively bring that message across, particularly over the next 6 weeks, but over the next 6 years?
I think this goes back to some comments that we've said earlier, which is, I think it's tied up with what the perception of arts is in relation to what's funded, and that's the majors and maybe the more kind of prestigious art forms like ballet and opera and things a lot of people don't actually go to. And I think that as often Australians don't realise they're interacting with arts and culture. They're going to the pub and they're seeing a band, or there's not really a real understanding that that's all a part of what we talk about when we talk about the arts sector. And I think that's got a lot to do with this kind of prestige that's attached to things when we talk about this conversation. Sorry, I've just lost my train of thought. I had a really good point. Sorry. You go
I'll
while
fill
I
in.
think.
I'll be your filler, and then at whatever moment goes straight over the top of me. The challenge, I think, is the same as any social movement. You don't waste a conversation. You keep advocating and advocating and advocating. That's how bad, horrific ideas start to get public support, and it's also how good ideas do. And it's hard, and it takes organising, and it takes using every opportunity, but you don't waste a conversation. Because the people undermining you, they're not wasting a conversation either. And sometimes that means turning up to the hostile audience. It also means, and this is one of the reasons why I think it's important that progressive parties that are supportive of the arts don't spend their time attacking each other to try to prove who's more progressive for the arts. And similarly, why I gave that story of music, of them saying, no, let's not go after each other. There are enough people who are a genuine enemy, who want to cut funding, who have no respect for culture. That's the argument we need to win, and we need to be engaging assertively.
Sorry, I just wanted to also add that I feel like one additional part of the discussion that will help contribute to this is to recognise how much the export of the kinds of art forms like ballet and opera as our Australian voice actually presents us as not a post-colonial nation, and presents us as entirely still a colonial nation, and that if we can try to communicate to the people publicly and in personal conversations about the fact that if we don't invest in art that doesn't come from elitist art traditions that come from our colonisers, then we aren't actually building ourselves as a national voice that is who we actually are. And I would like to see that happen in the public conversation about the fact that we are not being post-colonial in that funding process approach.
And I think it's also that, for the majority of us, life is pretty good, even though we keep getting things cut. So you can still, for the average person who consumes art, I can still go to the big concert a year that I want to go to, and I can still go to the movies, and I do this and that. And as it slowly deteriorates, it's very difficult to see it disappearing. And I think it has to go back to that conversation, the point that I made earlier about audience development. It has to be that every time you walk out the door, you are hearing or seeing or consuming art. It is in the shops, it's in the background music when you're doing your grocery shopping, it's everywhere, it's designed on posters, on buses, it's everywhere. And again, I think having a cultural plan and a policy is about saying we need to support Australians to do that, to create the Australian stories and the Australian sounds and the Australian music, because the more support we have for that, then the more acknowledgement we have that that is important and it's coming from our own people.
Yes.
Yeah, sorry. I'm Katarina Bakich from Stats National. So I'm just like picking up on some of the thematic things here, just actually realising that through a lot of these funding cuts, a lot of the advocacy organisations that do the very lobbying for the small to medium sector have been literally annihilated and not operating on reserves and trying to sort of still service and lobby the sector. So I guess in a sense, what's your view with regard to advocacy, like support for advocacy bodies within the performing arts sector, and also to really refreshing to hear about the cross-portfolio investment, because it does actually do so much. Sort of recently, people are aware in the UK with the social prescribing, generating employment for artists through GPs being able to send their patients, to a dance class, to a singing class, to a drama group or a choir, to actually reduce isolation, to make a difference in our communities, and also to improve social cohesion. So that's really great to hear that hopefully that will extend to the wider policy. But just interested in how you feel about the advocacy orgs, given that we do the very lobbying that a lot of the issues that have been brought up about touring, and how do we actually get into the ear of people?
There's an in principle point that I start with, and then my second point refutes it, and my second point wins. My in principle point is it feels odd in the first instance to be using taxpayers' money to fund an organisation to lobby you back. Like, in principle, it is an odd thing to do. The second argument that I use to refute that is simply the counter narrative. If you don't fund these organisations, then the department, the OSCO, and your own conversations that you happen to have are all you've got to go on. And the department is good, the public service is good, but the public service now is much, much thinner than it was when I was last in government. Their capacity is not what it used to be. Still, brilliant people there, but they've been really thinned out over the last 6 years. Australia Council, similar. And so if you end up, for what in the grand scheme of things is a modest investment, either directly or through the Australia Council, having some funding for the organisations that then lobby you back, if the result is better public policy, then it's worth the investment, even though in the first instance it feels a bit weird.
Thanks. Was there any more questions? Yes, up there.
Hi, I'm Tina, I'm a filmmaker. There's a British Film Industry Fund, and I'm not sure of numbers, please don't want to rush me for this, but just in general, they have, so say someone's got £100 million prize money, 10% is forced to go back into the arts, and it's divided up into all sectors. So filmmakers can apply, everyone can apply, and I'm just wondering why Australia doesn't do something similar. There's so many big prize monies out there. In a way, it's people putting money back into the arts themselves, the same as giving it to the government. Is there a way to make that something Australia could do as well?
I haven't had that one raised with me before. I've had prize money and how it's taxed raised with me. I haven't had that exact frame that you've just put to me before. So thank you. I'll make a note and I'll get my head around it.
Like 10% of all massive prize monies that went back into the arts, I think we all
Yeah, I haven't had that put to me before, so I can't offer anything constructive. But I've written it down.
Sorry? Oh, yes.
Another question up the back here. Mr. Berg, Matthew Westwood from the Australian newspaper. Hello. A two-part question, if I may. You said that Labor would give back money taken from the Australia Council.
No, I didn't. I said we have not announced that. I said at the last election we made a promise of that nature, and I cannot make announcements today. They'll be made at our policy launch.
All right, so we'll look forward to that. The second part of the second part.
That was a good try. Yeah. I respected your job.
The other part of the question is talking about the relative proportions of funding for the major performing arts companies and the small to medium sector. What do you think is an appropriate proportion of funding from the federal government for each?
My view is if there is to be reform, and obviously reform is not solely the ambit of a federal minister because the states are involved in that entire structure. So all a federal minister can bring to the table is a disposition, and then you have a negotiation. In the first instance, the proportion has shifted because of the Brandis cuts and shifted substantially. The claim from the government that they have returned the funding, even though you've got the point I said before about them effectively being a contract manager, restores what was the original balance between the two pools. It just means that one side of the balance, it's accounted there, but they can't actually access the cash. But I think that gives a sense of how the two should relate. But I don't have a problem in there being a longer tail if you change how the major performing arts companies work and are funded, and the system of KPIs, which would allow other companies to be able to join up. But I think it's worth thinking of things in a different way, because we've all got used to this being a club or whatever it is with a funding cliff. You're either in or you're out. And we've all associated it with the principle of they're the majors that get funded that way. I prefer to think of it of two different methods of funding. Funding for established organisations based on their record, measured against the KPIs of cultural policy, versus project funding. And they're two different ways of being funded. I don't necessarily think that first form of funding is something that should only belong to the largest organisations. And so I don't mind there being a situation where you had more companies on that form of funding. But some companies won't want to because they won't want to give up, the full access to project funding. So there's judgment calls that companies would make. But the principle I don't see as one versus majors versus the rest. I see it as funding on your record and regularly measured against project funding.
Thanks, Tony. And I just wanted to throw one thing back that, based on projects, that there is also the problem that as an independent artist, when you are formulating a new project, when you are asking for the money before you've begun, that there are major issues with that, which is why I propose the idea of a living wage for artists so that they can collaborate and begin to make projects before they have to justify who they are and what they make. Thank you. And Vivian's just going to wrap up for us.
I was just going to say we promised Tony Burke's chief of staff that he'd be out here at 7 because this has been his hard gig for the night. He's now heading off to the ABC to do Q&A. So I really better let him go. But I'm so grateful to you for finding the time to come here. It's been wonderful for us to hear from you. Terry, you are an inspiration. You really are. Someone who's surviving up there in the commercial world and this other world that we all try and inhabit and survive in. So well done you, and Kate and thank you so much for doing a great job, and we look to watch your start continue to rise on the sky. Thank you.
Thank you.